Pastor Mark Conforti here with a very special edition of Cheerwine Chat, my conversation with Dr. Justin Phillips. Justin is a native of Jackson, Tennessee, a graduate of Union University, Duke Divinity School, and Fuller Theological Seminary. He has taught at the high school and college levels. He is a theologian specializing in Christian ethics. He is a published author, currently the executive director of The Other Journal, and recently, Know Your Place, helping white Southern evangelicals cope with the end of the world or their world. A provocative title, right? With so many challenges around the world and in our own country, and certainly in light of the gospel's high calling to bring healing and reconciliation to this world, I believe that Dr. Phillips' book will have tremendous wisdom and insight for us. Now, in full disclosure, Justin is a dear friend. We roomed together, along with a couple of other guys in a house during our second year at Duke Divinity School. So, without any further ado, here it is, my conversation with Dr. Justin Phillips. Dr. Justin Phillips, welcome to Cheerwine Chat.
Hey, Mark, good to be here.
Yeah, man, look, I've got a Cheerwine. Do they make that in Knoxville too?
They do, actually. I can show you here that.
You had to have a UT coupe.
Yes, indeed.
Of course. Okay, very good. Well, listen, I'm really excited about this book that's being published, soon to be released. Of all the topics that you could write about in the Christian life, why this one?
Yeah, it's funny. I was asking myself the same question it was about 8 years ago when I was wrapping up my dissertation, and I was right in the middle of just the stress of this is never going to end. Or at points like this topic is way too big. Why did I choose this? And really even just doing that reflective work of pausing for a minute and go, how did I get to this point? And so it's funny. I realized it was a few things, none of which I realized in the moment. I didn't realize the genesis of these thoughts, but the first thing, so I was writing a dissertation on how white evangelicals in the South responded to the civil rights movement. And that came about in part because my academic mentor, David Gushee, wrote his dissertation on, and it was eventually his first book, Righteous Gentiles of the Holocaust. And so I remember in college thinking, oh, that's just an interesting thing to do from a writer's standpoint, is to look at this dramatic event, and as you look through who the cast of characters are, to kind of focus on the righteous Gentiles, which would not be the most immediate players that you would expect to consider in that drama. And so for me, it was this kind of aha moment of like, maybe one day I'll study some about like what white people did in the civil rights movement. And as you write a dissertation, you begin to narrow it down. So for me, it was evangelicals and then the South. Going further back than that, though, I realized, and this was maybe the real aha moment for me that I include in the book, was that I really think the real true genesis of all of these thoughts came also in college when I was diagnosed with cancer. And the reason for that is, so I went to a kind of small Christian college, pretty homogenous place, like a lot of small Christian colleges are. And you kind of get known for being a certain thing or having a thing like, there's the guy that wears this high school letter jacket everywhere. Or there's the guy that's, that's the baseball player. And there was some things that I was involved in on campus, but I think that really when I got my diagnosis and I remained in school during treatment, I felt like my entire identity was collapsed into that of cancer patient. And so people were always talking to me, approaching me, a lot of times just total strangers, asking about my health, kind of my days were kind of filled with awkward conversations. And it was at that point that I realized a couple of things. One is that like my body or my health was now this like curiosity to people. like I was noticed. Whereas before I probably could have been pretty invisible from time to time if that's what I had wanted. And the other thing too that kind of the light bulb just clicked on for me is like, this must be what it's like for people of color on this campus that is, 90+% white. And so I wouldn't say that I immediately could fully empathize with what people of color went through in these majority spaces, but it was just like a little glimpse into that kind of what that existence might feel like. And so then I think it just sort of deepened my empathy, and I was fortunate enough to like make some friendships, and we just began to talk about, hey, what is life like for you in this admittedly weird space? And that really kind of opened my eyes. And then from there, when we met, at Duke Divinity, those friendships just broadened, my interests deepened, and fast forward to where we are now, where I decided I would focus my dissertation on it, and then eventually write a book on it that I hope would be kind of helpful to people who were a lot like me when I was 21 years old, of just living in kind of a majority space and not really being aware of my body, or being aware of like, physicality, not being aware of like how people's identities do get collapsed into one thing all the time. That's kind of the long story of how I got here.
Long, but very helpful. And think about this, age 2021, here we are, year 2021, and you're talking about aha moments. And a lot of the times we talk about woke culture. At the end of the first section of your book, you talk about waking up. So what do you mean by waking up?
Yeah. That's the original like title, I think, for that chapter was utilizing the word woke in a very early draft. And I scrapped it in large part just because of the way that I think the term woke has been hijacked and culturally appropriated. So I'll tell you a quick story. The very first time I ever heard the word woke just used as kind of a expression was when I was living in Southern California doing doctoral work, and was talking to a friend of mine that I'd made after moving there. So this would have been about 13 years ago. And as we were just conversing at one point, he said, yeah, that's woke. And I kind of paused for a minute, just because at that point I'm in my early 30s, and I'm like, I don't know what the kids are talking about these days. And I said, well, okay, so break that down for me. What does that mean? And they kind of said, oh, woke means, a kind of like awakening, or like a way of saying, okay, you get what's going on. And I remember really liking it, but I didn't like work it into my regular vocabulary or anything like that. And then, so of course, we fast forward to today, and the majority of times I hear the word woke, it's typically from middle-aged white people right now. And it's a point of fear. It's a point of like, it's always used in the sense of like they're trying to cancel us, us being anything that is white, or anything that is majority culture. And I think that's just kind of it just speaks to what I think sometimes white folks can do, is that they can misunderstand the origins of a thing. And so that's maybe I ditched using the word woke and kind of settled on, I think the language that people are a bit more comfortable with, about like, hey, when you wake up to something, or your eyes are opened, the scales fall from your eyes, kind of whatever metaphor you want to use. It's my way of concluding the section on what it means to be a white person, and to say, it's to note that yes, things are changing in our culture, in our churches, in our schools, and just kind of like throughout society. And there are some really beautiful things about that. And there are some divisions that can be healed. There are some hurts that can be healed if you'll allow yourself um, to listen. So I try not to use the word woke too much these days. And if I can engage in a conversation with someone who is using it almost as a slur, I want to talk to them a bit and say, okay, like what are you really fearful of? Because when I hear the word woke from my friend, when I replay it in my memory, 13 years ago or so, I hear like this point of connection between him and I. That was a meaningful conversation.
It's a meaningful conversation for all of us in America. It has a distinctive tone for us in the Southeast. What do you think makes that such an important conversation for us, given our geography and history?
Right. No, it's whenever you decide to write a book, you have to kind of carve out a little bit of a spot and where your work is going to fit, because otherwise you're just going to rehash a good bit of what's already been said. And certainly in the last few years, especially, you've got no shortage of choices for books about race. So my first thing is I just wanted to write a book from a posture of maybe talking to friends that I went to high school or college with, or writing a book for my Sunday school teachers who, raised me in church, and just say, hey, uh, I'm still with you. I still love you. I didn't go away to seminary and get messed up. I wanted to write something from a point of commonality. So the American South, I think that the South is the connective tissue between what it means to be white and what it means to be an evangelical. And I know that there are white evangelical pockets all across the nation, all across the world. Um, but I think the South is the place that binds together the racial identity with the religious identity. And I know that we could go pretty deep into neo-evangelicalism really kind of started in the Northeast and all that, but I'm talking more of like a contemporary understanding of what evangelicalism is and where it really flourished. And so for me, as I was reflecting on the three communities that have shaped me the most, it was this odd, admittedly amorphous, sometimes community called like white or whiteness. It was the American South. I love talking about the South. I love being a Southerner, actually. And then also the evangelical community, which is the place that brought me the places and the people that brought me into the faith at First Baptist Church, Union City. So it's all very particular for me. And sometimes I've felt that conversations about white evangelicals get bogged down a little bit to where we're speaking of them as like a polling demographic that is a bit abstract. And so the effort here is to make things just a little bit more particular, to say, okay, I don't know what it's like to be a white evangelical in Colorado Springs, but I think there's some commonalities of Southern experience across, however you define the South. That's another thing I talk in the book, is that it speaks to a kind of like disembodied nature of Southern life, is that we can't even agree on what or where the South is and where it ends. So where race is concerned, these three communities, white, Southern, and evangelical, I think they all kind of have blind spots when it comes to issues of race and racism. And I think they all reinforce one another. So there's no sort of corrective. So if you're a white person, you probably feel a certain amount of trepidation talking about race, period. If you're a white Southerner, I think that anxiety creeps up a bit more. And if you're a white Southern evangelical, you might not feel like you've got the resources at all to discuss these things. So that's
So
kind of why focusing on the South.
that's a great segue into another question. What are the resources that we receive from the scriptures, the tradition of Christianity? What are the resources that we need to have in our heart and in our mind as we have these conversations, as we try to figure things out, as we build rapport with people, even people who are different than us? What are those?
Yeah, it's such an important question, and I think that it's for me it has meant reading the Bible through I won't say like through a racial lens, but it has been trying to recognize the places in the scripture where a corollary exists for some of the issues that we face today. So while the Bible doesn't like speak to a conception of race, except for the human race that you'll see sometimes on bumper stickers or something, but the Bible is filled with um, stories about ethnic, tribal, um, people group conflicts. And if you understand that all of us are made in the image of God, and that from the very beginning, God is trying to rescue his people, to restore and redeem creation, to bring us all back together to him and in him, then I think that you begin to see the ways in which the Bible is communicating that story throughout the Hebrew Bible and through the New Testament. You know, like Jesus as this first century Palestinian Jewish man is calling us into himself, so into his body. And so like this Jewish body becomes the site, becomes the location of like where divisions break down, and where like some really, by the world standards, scandalous friendships begin to take place and begin to happen. And so then reconciliation is possible. You know, reconciliation is what God does, and then we are invited to live into God's reality of reconciliation, to perform that and live that out in and among each other. And then too, like just to very simply, to to love our neighbor and to find ways in which we can love our neighbor, and to recognize, and this is the point I try to make for at least evangelicals, is that like, you know, even for those of who might be like really focused on like the end times, or kind of particular sort of like apocalyptic visions, like the vision we get in Revelation 7 is like is multilingual, multi-ethnic, multi-tribal body praising the resurrected Lord, you know, and the image we get is that of people singing in their own tongues, their own language, inhabiting their own body, not some sort of like whitewashed, we all become like one sort of thing. We have a common goal and a common Lord that we are praising, but we are there. It's the multiplicity that creates the beautiful vision. So that's Genesis to Revelation in like 2 minutes. That I think that's the story the Bible tells.
Yeah, the story starts out in a garden, and then it ends in Revelation with a new heaven and a new earth. And there's that beautiful image about the tree whose leaves are for the healing of the nations. And I think what we need is some healing.
Yeah.
To wrap up, tell us, how did you land on the book title? because it's not just a double entendre, it's
Sure.
almost a triple entendre there.
Yeah. So the title of the book is Know Your Place, Helping White Southern Evangelicals Cope with the End of the World. And there's a parenthetical, the end of their world. Know Your Place was a pretty harsh phrase I heard, even growing up as a kid in the 80s and 90s. Like, know your place was still in heavy rotation in some places, which is kind of cringeworthy to think about now. But it was a way of saying you need to know your station in life. Don't attempt to rise above it, because this is where you belong. And so there are probably white readers who will think that is, I'm just reversing that and saying that to them. But I'm really not. I'm really trying to say, like, anytime I feel like I'm preaching a little bit, I understand I'm just preaching either to myself or I'm preaching to a younger version of myself. So it's a way of saying, like, as a white Southern evangelical growing up, I was largely an ahistorical person. I didn't understand race. I didn't understand concepts of race or where they had come from. I received a version of Southern history that at points was, I went to a wonderful public school. And so I know I wasn't getting just propaganda, but at points, depending on who the teacher was, I'm sure I received some distortions about what slavery was or what the Civil War was or what Jim Crow was or was not. But again, kind of ahistorical. And I think one of the pitfalls of evangelicalism is that we've been largely an ahistorical people for a long time, of just not understanding the full breadth of church history. And so know your place is a way of like speaking a word of encouragement. You know, Wendell Berry's notion of place is to talk about, you know a place so that you can love it, and so that you too can be like loved by that place. And so when Berry talks about place, he's not talking just about geography. In part, it is about geography, but it's also about a sort of deep commitment to and love of the people and the things that inhabit that place. So in part, I'm saying, hey, in this time of like awakening that's happening racially, like, please take this opportunity to listen, to learn, to really reflect on these communities that have shaped you, and maybe some of the blind spots that those communities have. And so then the subtitle is that it is not the end of the world as you might think it is. You are not being canceled. You're not being wiped off the face of the earth. You know, the world is not ending, but your version of it, or your control over it in the kind of like really unhelpful, unhealthy, destructive ways. And here I am speaking broadly about just kind of, what white supremacy does to all of us. Like, white supremacy is unhealthy for all of us. That what comes on the other side of that awakening will be, or could be, something beautiful. It could be a vision of the kingdom of God. So put your faith in the resurrected one, not into these power structures that have held you up or intentionally blinded you for decades. And you may just find that it's not really the end of the world. It may just be like a little bit of, it's the end of one version of the world. And that should be like language I think evangelicals are pretty familiar with, and that kind of dichotomy they draw all the time between this place and the place that is really our home. So,
yeah, you were able to articulate this awakening within you. I'm so grateful you've been able to pursue this and share now in the publishing of this book. I'm really excited to pick it up and to read it, and can't wait to get back in touch with you and talk with you more. So thanks for taking time to talk with me. And I love the hopeful word that you ended on, that we need to have our hope and our faith in the resurrected one, not some sort of invisible system that we've been propping ourselves up with.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mark. It's been a pleasure.